Our next speaker today is Mr. Ian Milne, Director of Global Britain. Would you please give Mr. Milne a warm welcome?
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm delighted to be here. As you know, the EU is a political project, but its economic consequences, mainly unintended, are profound. Let me focus in this short talk on the questions of economics and trade and what they should be telling this country or indicating to this country how this country should position itself in the next 40 to 50 years. Let's start with a simple demographic fact. At present, the population of this country is less than 1% of the population of the globe. And by 2050, it'll be the same, though slightly less. So we'll still be just under 1% of global population. But in that 40-year span between now and the middle of this century, the world's labor force will increase by 30%. Labor force defined as those aged between 15 and 64. From the current 4.5 billion to round about 6 billion. And over that period, the next 40 years, with one exception, every continent on the planet will experience growth in its labor force. The exception, of course, is Europe. And within the EU, the 27 countries of the EU, amongst the 5 biggest economies, the UK is the exception. Only here will our labor force, i.e. the people who actually work, earn income, pay taxes, etc., is it going to grow between now and 2050? While the labor forces of Germany, France, Italy, and Spain will shrink. And they won't just shrink by a little bit. Between today and 2050, 40 years roughly, the EU will experience a loss in labor force of 54 million people. And what that means in effect is that over the next 40 years, the EU loses the whole of Germany, because 54 million happens to be the precise number of Germany's present-day labor force. And indeed, German population is already shrinking year by year. You can see it in the German statistics and in the United Nations statistics, which look at other countries as well. And indeed, there is a labor shortage in Germany today. That may not last much longer, but there is certainly a labor shortage in Germany today. Now, if we look outside Europe, across to the United States, they, in contrast to the EU, experience a growth in labor force between now and 2050 of around 36 million, which happens to be almost precisely the present-day labor force of Italy. So, if you like, in the next 40 years, the EU loses the whole of Germany, and the United States gains the whole of Italy and all the legendary productive powers of these two countries. Now, what we conclude generally from this is that over the next 40 years, the USA is going to become more powerful than it is today, economically, militarily, politically, culturally. During the same period, as is well known at the moment, Asia will continue to grow. It'll become ever more influential. Europe and the European Union as a whole will decline, whether economically, militarily, politically, culturally. If we look now at the nuts and bolts of what's going to happen in continental Europe especially, it's going to be a shrinking market. relatively attractive to exporters, including British exporters, and to investors, whether they be here or elsewhere in the world. This is because most EU member states will see falling demand for their bus houses, for their schools, for factories, for shops, capital goods, and allied to that, there will be falling asset values in those buildings and those businesses. And that is crucial because that will affect both the tax base of continental Europe and the equity markets on which private pension provision depends. So the tax base, as I say, of continental EU will shrink, and because the population of continental EU is simultaneously shrinking and aging, there'll be far less taxes, and therefore there will need to be far more borrowing, public sector debt, to pay for demand for healthcare and pensions, because at the same time there are fewer active people to provide them. It looks as if growth in GDP, market size, and equity returns will occur outside continental Europe. And this will continue to mean that within the EU itself, EU-wide one-size-fits-all policies, monetary, tax, labour market, agriculture, asylum, immigration, environment, etc., etc., will become even more ineffective. And so the political rationale of integration into a fading regional bloc, because that's what it is, the EU is a fading regional bloc, will become ever more questionable, and indeed is now, not just in this country, but on the continent, becoming ever more questionable. And for we British exporters, traders, investors, the economic rationale of integration into a contracting market, the EU, will become ever more questionable. So what should we do? It's pretty obvious. For us as a country, as a whole, for us to put up with, directly and indirectly, an economic burden on the whole economy of anywhere between 4% and 28% of GDP. 28%, by the way, was Gordon Brown's figure in 2005. It is pure madness. It's bonkers. It's stark-staring bonkers. What we should do is to leave the EU, save the money, and restore our democracy. And we should begin the process of catching up with the most prosperous countries in the world. How then, on withdrawal from the EU, should we in the UK refocus our export economy and our trade and our overseas investment? Well, many studies have shown that in the next 40 years, an overwhelming proportion of world GDP growth, nearly 80%, 80%, is going to occur outside Europe, the US, and Canada, outside Europe and North America. It's all going to happen, 80% of it's going to happen in Africa, Asia, Australasia, Latin America. Those, ladies and gentlemen, are the markets that if this country is going to succeed economically in the next 40 years, it has to get stuck into and really start expanding rather fast. Now, there are many ways of, as many of you in this room will know, there are many ways of addressing overseas markets. And it is fair, I think, to be fairly cautious about relying on international organizations to provide more than minimal help in so doing. But nevertheless, one thing that this country ought to think of doing is to look to an organization which is headquartered right here in London, a couple of miles away. It's in that direction. Its buildings are situated between Pall Mall and the Mall. It's an organization of which the Queen is head, whose working language is English, whose membership is 55 independent democratic countries, apart from ourselves. And this organization already accounts for over a third of global GDP. And indeed, its labor force accounts for over 40% of the global labor force. And of course, that body, which we invented, is called the Commonwealth. And the whole point about the Commonwealth is this. I'm quoting from the Commonwealth's Declaration of Commonwealth Principles, issued at the conference in Singapore, 22nd of January, 1971. Here's what it says. Commonwealth structure is based on unwritten traditional procedures and not on a formal constitution or other code. The Commonwealth is a voluntary association of sovereign, independent states, each responsible for its own policies. Now, I can't think of any body in the world which is the absolute opposite of the lot that sit in Brussels. This is the precise opposite. We invented it, and we should start reinvigorating it. Now, in 2050, as a market for British exporters and investors, the Commonwealth will represent a market 9 times greater than that of the rest of the European Union. 9 times. It's impossible to get more precise because we don't know exactly what's going to happen in the future, etc., etc. And I'm using here, as most other researchers do or commentators do, we're using labor force, those aged between 15 and 64, as a proxy for market size and market wealth. Nevertheless, the order of magnitude, or the orders of magnitude by which the Commonwealth markets will be greater than the European Union markets is, if not 9 times, and maybe it's 8 times, and maybe it's 10 times, but it's a big, big multiple. And incidentally, it's an organization which the French would give their eye teeth to have. And the French are no slouches when it comes to maximizing their influence in overseas organizations. Now, the British government, or successive British governments, not necessarily the last one, or the present one, have deliberately neglected this organization. One figure which will astound you and amuse you, and I got these figures very recently through a parliamentary question asked in the Lords, so it's a written answer, so we can assume that it's roughly correct. The question was, how much does Britain pay to the European Union every year, and how much does Britain pay to the Commonwealth every year? And the answer is that in 2009, this country paid roughly 4,000 times more to Brussels than we paid to the Commonwealth. 4,000 times. It's just an indication, but it's a measure, one measure of the shocking neglect of successive British governments of the Commonwealth in the last few years, and of the even more shocking insouciance with which this British government flings money into the bottomless pit, which is the Brussels budget. So, the logic is there for this country, once it gets out of the European Union, making the Commonwealth its primary vehicle or vector of especially commercial interests in the rest of the world. Just consider, the Commonwealth's labour force is going to increase by 60%, or 825 million, between now and 2050. While the labour force of the European Union shrinks by 57 million. So that means a swing, Commonwealth outside the UK compared with EU outside the UK. The swing in labour force is roughly 900 billion people. Now, even if many of that 900 million are relatively poor, it's still a huge and growing market. Two other statistics. By 2050, 96% of the Commonwealth's labour force will be in Asia and Africa. And by 2050, the Commonwealth will account for 45% of the Asian labour force and 45% of the African labour force. And India alone will account for 50% of the Commonwealth labour force in 2050, compared with 57% in 2010. So that, in a nutshell, ladies and gentlemen, is a brief run through where we are now, mainly economically, what's going to happen to the world, very broad brush, I confess, I admit, and how Britain could, if it wanted, position itself in the rising, growing, prosperous markets of the next 40 years. By the way, if anybody would like to see a short briefing note on the Commonwealth, the Commonwealth Neglected Colossus, Keith Carson has kindly agreed to put a sheaf of these on his table outside on the bookshelf outside the door there. Thank you.